Hi everyone, I'm Millie from ProWritingAid. Thank you so much for being with us today. Today we're joined by Hawley and Rachelle Ramirez. If you haven't been to one of their sessions yet, you're in for an absolute treat. Rachelle and Anne move fast and we're going to cover a lot in this session, but do not worry because you'll get the replay after. This is a session you'll probably want to return to again and again. Anne has 5 decades of writing experience and has been a developmental editor since 2015, and she's also the author of the historical love story Restraint. Like Anne, Rachelle was trained by Sean Coyne of StoryGrid and has edited award-winning and best-selling fiction and non-fiction. She has an MA in psychology from Goddard College, and she's the author of An Introduction to Genre. Anne, Rachelle, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Millie. Thanks for having us. It's great to be here. I can't believe how many people are in this session. It's really exciting. Thanks everybody for joining us. It's always a pleasure for Pages and Platforms to come and join these wonderful sessions with ProWritingAid. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started on our presentation here. Give me just a second to get this right. There we go. All right. Well, welcome to the Essentials of Writing Love Story. It's a masterclass from Pages and Platforms. Before we really get going, as you've already been told to type questions in the Q&A box, we will answer as many as we can at the end. We're going to go for about 45 minutes. Be sure to drop by storypath.me to download your free copy of the Pages and Platforms 7 Essential Story Types Guide. Today, we're covering one of the story types, the love story. The guide covers that and 6 other story types, and we'll get you in our mailing list for all of the exciting activities that Pages and Platforms has coming in the very near future. So let's get started. What brings you to this webinar today, all 800 of you? Do you want to write a story that makes your reader swoon? Most of us do. Are you exploring platonic love or love within marriage? Are you unsure how to really make your story work? Are you struggling with questions about creating a solid story structure? Do you have some scattered romantic and sexy scenes that aren't quite hanging together yet? Would you like to know more about what exactly a love story needs in order to actually be a love story? Do you wonder whether you're writing a romance novel or something else that has to do with love? Or would you just like to include a good love subplot in another story type? Whatever the case, you're in the right place. Rachelle and I have studied all kinds of love stories, and we've worked with many clients who are writing love stories. I am, as Millie mentioned, a love story author myself, so it's a topic of keen interest to me. First, I'd like to pull the camera way back and look at the whole landscape of love stories, just run through it real quickly. As storytellers, we feel drawn to tell certain kinds of stories, and our audience feels drawn to read or watch certain kinds of stories for certain subconscious reasons. It's part of our job as writers to become aware of what those reasons might be and write consciously. After basic bodily needs like food and shelter and basic safety and security, human beings need love and belonging. A human being does not survive in isolation. So this brings us to love stories. What are love stories even for? Why do we keep writing them, reading them, watching them, telling them? Love stories have a long history in human culture all around the world. So while the romance novel is a relatively modern invention, the love story goes way back and it spans the globe. Why? Probably because emotional attachment helps us survive as individuals and as a species. So of course we tell each other stories about it. It helps keep the skill alive. We have the prescriptive love story that involves a satisfactory, intimate connection between usually 2 people. This type, which includes the romance novel, upholds cultural norms like marriage, founding a family or a household, and contributing to the stability of the community. Prescriptive stories of love, friendship, and chosen family may also uphold values of generosity, sacrifice, and commitment. Then there's the cautionary love story. This type shows how ungoverned passions lead to unwanted social outcomes like obsession, stalking, or the destruction of family or community. Now, alternatively, the cautionary love story can also warn people about social sanctions they might face if they aren't cautious about pursuing a forbidden type of relationship. And we're going to see more of this when we get to the historical section. The depictions of love throughout the ages tend to center on marriage between a man and a woman, almost always the powerful classes. But marriage has long been considered a fundamental social good among nearly all classes. It's a privilege, marriage is, that has historically been withheld from certain oppressed castes, such as the enslaved, the disabled, and the very poor. In many cultures, marriage was also a way to ensure the subjection of women and the paternity of offspring, but also create a solid foundation for rearing children. It's important to understand that the idea of a love match or a marriage of passion is probably less than 200 years old in Western culture. Before that, societies looked on romantic love and erotic attachment as a kind of sickness. Political or economic considerations alone determined who married who. Proper unions were arranged by older and wiser heads in the community. And when it came to the ruling classes, the marital bond was all about dynasty and lineage. In fact, to quote Mark Manson in an excellent and very funny Medium post on the history of romantic love, quote, classic stories like the Iliad or Romeo and Juliet were not celebrations of love. They were warnings against its negative consequences of how romantic love can potentially ruin everything, close quote. So it's not surprising that many classical stories of love depict the kind of forbidden passion that did harm to the community or chased love from afar. Then we get to the late 18th century and the Industrial Revolution. More and more people in Western Europe and North America particularly became independent of the land. They moved away from extended families into towns and began to value individual choice, personal attraction, and passion in deciding who to marry. We come to World War I, which decimated a whole generation of young men in Europe, and it left women without much prospect of marriage. So they took solace in stories of romantic love. The UK publisher Mills and Boon filled the demand with weekly stories in the format that has come to be known as the romance novel. 100 years later, the romance book market generates $1.4 billion a year, that's billion with a B, in total revenues. These really, as I look at them, look like chocolate coins, don't they? That fits for love stories. So we can say that stories of romantic love have been pretty popular and remain pretty popular. But societal changes in the last half century have expanded the scope of the love story. Audiences want new stories that represent love among all sorts of people. Stories that might end in commitment or might end in temporary togetherness or in personal growth alone, or sometimes in tragedy. This variety includes not only relationships featuring queer characters, but new and non-traditional family configurations, intimate friendship, and platonic love and affection. Now, our examples today, the model that we're going to use is drawn from a romantic sexual love story, really a romance novel of a movie. But if you're interested, as I am, in stories of intimate friendship, platonic or queer platonic relationships, chosen family, and the like, you'll find plenty here that also applies to your work. Because, as you'll see, the love story form examines intimate human relationships of all kinds. So in this webinar today, you're going to discover what every love story needs in order to meet the expectations of the love story audience, and how to incorporate the essential story elements of love into your own love story. Before I turn it over to Rachelle to tell us all about those essential elements and how they work together, I just want to draw your attention to one other subject, marketing categories, which are sometimes called genres. When we talk about love stories, we're not only talking about the romance novel, as I hope is clear by now. Love can be a primary or a supporting story in all sorts of other kinds of stories, marketing categories, or genres. Some of the most popular marketing categories or genres are defined by the type of world where the story takes place. And the world where your love story takes place makes a big difference to what kind of love story you're telling. Let's take a look. Some popular worlds for love stories include fantasy worlds, science fiction worlds, dystopian futures, history, and war. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. There are lots of other marketing categories, and they change and new ones are developed all the time. But these will give you an idea of what a love story does when set in different genres or worlds, or vice versa, what different worlds and genres do to a love story. I encourage everyone as writers, whatever you're writing, to think a lot about why you want to set your story in any particular setting. Let's take a look at these ones one by one. First, there's fantasy, super popular category. Fantasy stories are set in worlds where magic or the supernatural is real, broadly speaking. There are some exceptions. One of the reasons you might want to set a love story in a fantasy world is to examine the universality of love, even between more than human people, between people from different worlds or planes of existence, or between a human and a non-human. Or you may want to look at love beyond the veil of death. A classic example of a love story in a fantasy world is Beauty and the Beast. Here, the love interest is a cursed prince who's been turned into a non-human creature, kind of a monster, and is redeemed by Beauty's love. Another example, The Untamed, very popular current Chinese drama. It's a love story set in a kind of a mythical version of ancient China, where Taoist warriors cultivate magical powers that allow, among other things, the love relationship to endure beyond death and through reincarnation. In the lovely 1990 movie Truly, Madly, Deeply, a grieving woman finds love again after her dead fiance comes back as a ghost to help her heal. Next, we have science fiction, another popular and enduring category. Science fiction stories go into the future or into an alternate present, generally involving advanced technology, sometimes involving outer space. And setting a love story in a science fiction world is a good way to explore whether our contemporary ideas of love and intimacy can persist either long into the future or under technological change, or whether it can happen between humans and aliens or humans and artificial life forms. An example of this is the film Her, where a man falls in love with a computer-generated assistant. Another example is Passengers, the movie that uses a generation ship in space to tell a form of the last two people on Earth love story, or you could also view it as a version of the Adam and Eve origin story of humankind. Next, we go to the dystopian future. This story has been a popular category since about the mid-20th century with Brave New World in 1984. Dystopian stories usually have kind of a science fiction-y element because they go into the future like science fiction. But the focus is to show how our real world could go badly wrong. Now, you might set a love story in a dystopian future to examine the revolutionary power of love under extreme conditions imposed by something like tyranny or plague or other catastrophes. And these days, that's starting to sound like real everyday contemporary life. An example of a dystopian love story is Matched, the novel Matched, where a computer glitch sends a young woman on a quest for love that will disrupt her fragile society. Another very well-known example is The Hunger Games, mostly an action story, but it has a strong love subplot, and it pits love against survival and against tyranny. Next, we have the ever-popular historical story. Historical stories are set in the real world of the past. As L.P. Hartley famously said, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. So the fascination of a love story set in history is looking at how the morals, customs, and social structures of the past might have affected the pursuit of love. My own novel of Forbidden Love, Restraint, takes place in the English Regency and explores how true love between two men could survive in a society where their love was technically still a capital crime. Another example, Last Night at the Telegraph Club, is set in San Francisco's Chinatown in the 1950s, where a Chinese-American teenager breaks powerful family tradition by discovering her sexuality at a lesbian nightclub and falling in love with a white girl. Another one is Aristotle and Dante discover the secrets of the universe. Great novel. This tells the story of a committed friendship between two boys in 1970s Texas and the courage and self-realization it takes for both of them to cause that friendship to grow into love. And by the way, if you like audiobooks, this one is read by Lin-Manuel Miranda and it's fabulous. Finally, there's the always dramatic war story. War stories, like the name says, are set against a backdrop of war or in a war. A wartime setting is also, of course, likely to be historical. And of course, there can be war taking place in fantasy, science fiction, and dystopian worlds as well. So there's some blur here. But the particular power of setting a love story during a war is to examine how large-scale violence affects people's ability to meet and love, how war might bring people together who should be enemies, and how war experiences can create intimacy out of shared hardship. Here's some examples. Under the Udala Trees tells of two young girls of different ethnic groups and social classes who fall in love against the backdrop of the Nigerian Civil War in the 1960s and the unhappy aftermath that forces them apart. The Song of Achilles is the retelling of the Iliad, centered on the love relationship between Achilles and Patroclus and the powerful negative impact that love has on the course of a long and brutal war. And of course, the war itself, if you know the classical story, is caused by a forbidden romance between a man and the beautiful Helen of Troy. And then finally, World War II brings a married woman and a selfish single man together in Casablanca, the story of forbidden love and its redemptive power. So those are our examples. And these marketing categories are important. They may greatly influence a reader's decision whether or not to read your story. Many readers absolutely do make a beeline for the science fiction shelf at the bookstore, the fantasy heading on the bookseller's site. This right here is this main directory sign at Powell's City of Books here in Portland, Oregon, where Rachelle and I both live. It's an image of how booksellers place books on shelves and how readers go to look for them. So definitely know your settings and your marketing categories. Each one has its own rules, and you do need to be familiar with them. For instance, if you're writing in a fantasy world, you need to know the latest trends for that kind of story. You need to read widely and deeply in your marketing category and any subcategory that you're planning to write in. You need to know what your intended reader expects to find, and then part of your job is to surprise them. And in other words, you need to do your research, do your market research. All of that is important, but marketing category or setting type alone does not tell you much of what you need to know as a writer to construct and complete your love story. These setting types or marketing categories do not tell you how to meet the expectations of your love story reader. They don't tell you the want and need, that is the desire that drives your protagonist forward in the story. They don't tell you what the protagonist has to lose or gain, that is the stakes inherent in the story. Marketing categories also don't tell you how the love story protagonist changes under pressure from the antagonist. They don't give you the fundamental premise or message of the love story. They don't tell you what emotions the love story reader expects to find in the pages of your book. And they don't define the situations, characters, and moments that your love story must have in order to work. Those things, desire, stakes, change, premise, emotion, situations, characters, and moments, don't worry, you'll hear this again, are the essential elements of any good working story. And now I'm going to hand the microphone off to Rachelle to tell you exactly how to structure those essential elements to create an emotionally satisfying love story. So Rachelle, take it away.
Thanks, Anne. I'm going to draw examples from the film God's Own Country for each of the points we cover here. The film's an award-winning fabulous movie by Francis Lee, and it meets every basic requirement of a romantic love story while innovating by featuring gay working class characters whose primary difficulty is not homophobia and who do not experience love as a tragedy. The love story uses all the tools of good storytelling, which means there are some things your love story must have. And I'll list these essentials first, and then we'll go into them one by one. A love story needs a protagonist with a singular, particular, conscious want and a subconscious need. We refer to these as the desire. The desire establishes clear stakes for the protagonist, that is, what they have to gain and what they have to lose. In pursuit of their desire, the protagonist must undergo a change from the beginning to the end of the story. Your love story must have a premise, sometimes called a theme or controlling idea, that operates in every scene. It has to deliver a certain kind of emotion to the intended love story reader. And it has to contain specific types of situations, characters, and moments to be the love story your reader expects. These are the 6 essential elements that every good story needs: desire, stakes, change, premise, emotion, situations, characters, and moments. And when all of them are clear, your love story is on the right track. Now let's get into these one by one. The first essential element in any story is a desire the protagonists want and need. The love protagonist wants something consciously, usually either to gain love or avoid its entanglements, but they need to make some kind of internal change, usually to become more vulnerable and open to love before love is possible for them. Either partner may need to gain wisdom, prove themselves, or atone for past wrongs. In God's Own Country, the protagonist, Johnny, wants to be free of attachments and responsibility, but he needs to learn to be vulnerable, value the life he has, and to take responsibility for it. Now for the next essential element, stakes. The stakes in a story are what the protagonist stands to gain or lose by going after what they want. Stakes must operate in every scene, and they must escalate throughout the story. That means the experiences of the protagonist get harder and harder as the story goes on. In a love story, the protagonist generally stands to gain love, acceptance, togetherness, and the benefits of marriage or partnership. Those are some big rewards. The love protagonist stands to lose things like a comfortable single way of life, their familiar coping mechanisms, and being safe from rejection, potentially big losses. In a story of forbidden love, the protagonist might stand to lose even more, such as their life, their freedom, and membership in their community. Anne's novel Restraint is a good example of this type of story. In God's Own Country, Johnny stands to become vulnerable and lose his careless way of life and his old coping mechanisms. He stands to gain intimacy, acceptance, and a true partnership in both love and work. The next essential element in any story is change. Your love story protagonist must undergo a clear change from the beginning of the story to the end, and that change must arise from their desire and the stakes. The internal change will be driven by external events. Like in God's Own Country, Johnny begins internally detached and angry, but ends trusting and vulnerable. Externally, he starts the story careless of his family farm, and he ends engaged in developing it. The next essential element every story needs is a clear premise that operates in every scene. The premise is the message you hope your story will convey to your reader. It's expressed in a simple cause and effect statement. It's tied to the protagonist's desire and what's at stake in achieving that desire. You may think a love story doesn't need any fancier message than love conquers all, but there are stronger possibilities. Here are some very basic love story premises you can build on. Some. You could use desire leads to intimacy, or the love of another demands sacrifice, or selfishness causes loss of love, or even kindness gives rise to love. You don't need a full-blown thesis for a premise. The premise we've found in our example story of God's Own Country is pretty simple. It's a young man's willingness to be vulnerable allows for love and togetherness. Next, there's that all-important element, emotion. Now, audiences choose certain kinds of stories in order to feel certain kinds of emotions. The story delivers emotion through empathy with the character because of their desire and their need to change and what they have to go through to achieve it. So the love story audience often wants to feel romance or the satisfaction of personal attachment, because remember, the love story is not just about romance. And the audience likes to experience intimacy and vulnerability without risk. In God's Own Country, Johnny's slow and reluctant surrender to Gheorghe's kindness delivers romantic pleasure and an experience of intimacy. Okay, so that's desire, stakes, change, emotion, and premise. Our final essential element is made up of the specific kinds of characters, situations, and moments a story requires. For the love story, the essential characters are a protagonist who is often someone avoiding love or intimacy. You need an antagonist. Now, keep in mind that antagonist in a love story doesn't mean they must be a traditional villain or enemy. Generally, you also need at least one ally character and one hinderer. Let's look at each essential character in a bit more detail. The protagonist in a love story is usually the character avoiding the entanglements of love, and it's really less common to find a protagonist actively seeking love. The protagonist has a weakness or a flaw that they have to overcome before intimacy can enter their life. Maybe they're selfish, they're misinformed, or they have all their priorities all screwed up. The protagonist of God's Own Country is Johnny. He's a reluctant farmer tied to the land by family responsibilities, and he's longing for escape, and he's avoiding intimacy. The antagonist in a love story isn't a villain or evil. They just feel antagonistic to the protagonist because they put enormous pressure on the protagonist to change. Usually, it's the other partner, the one pursuing love or friendship. They are at least more open to love, attraction, or a friendship than the protagonist is. They must have different and complementary strengths, weaknesses, and desires from the protagonist. The antagonist in God's Own Country is Gheorghe, a migrant worker with no ties to family who wants to live on the land. A love story specifically benefits from characters who are allies or hinderers. The ally is a character who wants to help the two prospective partners get together. The hinderer is a character motivated to prevent the connection. And this could be out of jealousy or spite or social concerns. In God's Own Country, the hinderer is Johnny's disabled father, and the helper is the grandmother. Those are the essential characters. And here are a few quick character tips. Let your reader experience the difference between the principal characters. In God's Own Country, we see Johnny underappreciative of his family and his farm. He's doing the bare minimum to survive. Gheorghe, on the other hand, takes pride in farm work and desperately wants a connection to others and the land. Make the audience feel for the protagonist by seeing the impact missing love has had on the protagonist's life. God's Own Country opens with scenes of Johnny sick from abusing alcohol, disconnected from his family, his farm, and intimacy. He feels trapped. You'll want to encourage reader empathy or identification with the antagonist as well. In God's Own Country, we immediately embrace soft-spoken Gheorghe when he suffers Johnny's verbal abuse, shares about his loss of family and land, and demonstrates a strong work ethic. The next essential element in a story is the setting. And for the love story, the requirements of setting are pretty simple. The setting simply has to allow for the partners to meet and discover more about one another. Effectively, that only rules out complete isolation. In God's Own Country, the reluctant protagonist has to take the antagonist into his home, and they have to spend an extended period of time alone together. Dun, dun, dun. But here are a couple of things to think about with regard to the setting of your love story. A remote, isolated location removes choice from the prospective partners, and it's more likely to give rise to obsessive love or stories more about survival than love. A busy urban location allows more choices and more competition for each of the partners' attention. And besides the setting, different situations serve different kinds of stories. Let's look at the 7 situations a love story must supply. First, attraction and/or desire knock the protagonist out of their equilibrium, either by enticing them towards a close relationship, threatening their comfortable present way of life, or both. In God's Own Country, Johnny's father forces him to pick up George from the bus station. And it turns out the unwanted migrant worker is an attractive young man. Something more than the love relationship must be at stake. Some external need drives the actions of one partner or another. For example, other commitments, financial loss or gain, or family considerations. In God's Own Country, the love relationship threatens the everyday life of the farm household and business. The third essential situation is something outside the partners opposes their love connection. They could be on opposing teams or warring clans. They could be separated by land or time or bound by familiar obligations, etc. The opposition is usually embodied by characters such as the hinderer. In God's Own Country, Johnny's father, the hinderer, states that George must leave the farm in 2 weeks, which would obviously separate the partners. The fourth essential situation is that the protagonist has a strong inner need to change in order to make a love commitment or be worthy of another character's commitment. The desire for a love connection is necessary, but it's not sufficient on its own. In God's Own Country, Johnny must learn to be vulnerable and to appreciate the gifts life has given him. Next, each partner must have some internal attribute or gift to offer the other, something the other lacks. And well, this is the idea behind the old cliche of where the other says, "You complete me," right? In God's Own Country, George has a love of farming and farming skills that Johnny lacks. Johnny has land and ties to family that George lacks. Another essential situation for a love story is that the attraction between the main characters must be plausible. But note, that plausibility is defined by the audience empathy toward the characters and not necessarily by social conventions external to the story, like Hollywood style physical attractiveness. In God's Own Country, it's understandable that 2 young gay single men develop an attraction to one another when confined for a period of time. For our 7th essential situation, there must be some conflict between the partners, something they disagree on and need to come to terms with about the other. The protagonist's arc of change is defined by doing what's necessarily internally and externally to resolve this conflict. In God's Own Country, Johnny and George disagree about the rewards of farm life and about the need for emotional vulnerability in a romantic relationship. And that completes the essential characters, settings, and situations. Finally, we have the essential moments. These are really important. because essential moments are the change points that drive your story from beginning to end. These essential moments must happen, and in this specific order, if you want your love story to work. They form the armature, or, well, the central structure of your story. Essential moment number one is the setup. Here you show the protagonist engaged in their everyday activities, which will be relevant to their arc of avoiding and, well, finally gaining a relationship. In God's Own Country, we see Johnny sidesteps farm work. He abuses alcohol and he has sex with a stranger, casting doubt on his ability to sustain a farm and meaningful relationships. We picked this screenshot because images of what he's actually doing in the setup were a little explicit. Next comes the inciting incident. So this is where the other person, the antagonist, appears and throws the protagonist into attraction, changing their state from settled to unsettled. In God's Own Country, handsome migrant worker Georgi arrives to work on Johnny's family farm for the lambing season. Third, at the peak of your first act, the love protagonist tries to hide or deny their attraction. In God's Own Country, Johnny calls Georgi a racial slur and downplays his contributions to the farm. As you move into Act 2, your job is to set up complications. Now, the protagonist attraction is picked, and they begin to respond to overtures from the other. In God's Own Country, Johnny responds with sexual aggression when Georgi confronts him verbally. He tackles him for a fight. Act 2 is all about raising the stakes from that initial complication. Quite often, external forces begin to keep the main characters apart. In other stories, it's the protagonist's internal barriers to intimacy that do this job. In God's Own Country, Johnny and Georgi are isolated together in the hills and become sexual partners. But Johnny is emotionally incapable of real intimacy. The sixth essential moment is the midpoint shift. Now, this separates Act 2 from Act 3, and it's where the protagonist shifts from being reactive to proactive, or they go from defense to offense. In God's Own Country, when Georgi makes Johnny see the beauty and value of the land he's been trying to escape from, Johnny moves from rejecting a relationship with Georgi to pursuing it. The seventh essential moment is the big one. Now, this is the global peak. Following a breakup or separation, the protagonist makes a last-ditch effort to show they've changed, knowing they may fail to win the other back. In God's Own Country, Johnny stands up to his father. He travels to Scotland, where Georgi is now working, in hopes of bringing him back to the farm. The resolution: the partners reunite and commit to a relationship, or the antagonistic force succeeds in keeping them apart, or the relationship can't progress beyond attraction and fails. In God's Own Country, Johnny expresses his love for Georgi and they return to the farm together. And if you deliver all these essential moments, your audience will love your love story. While an engaged audience might forgive a missing essential character or situation, you strengthen your story when you deliver them all. So now for the big final question: how the heck do you put all these essential elements together to write your love story? Let's look at the 4-act structure of a beginning hook, a middle build, divided into 2 halves. We'll call them middle build A and middle build B, and the ending payoff. You want to open the story by introducing the protagonist's ordinary world and showing them doing what's familiar and normal for them. use the ordinary world to demonstrate the protagonist's flaw or fear. Why? Well, because we need to have empathy for the protagonist if we're going to care whether they find love or not. Flaws and fears make a character empathetic and give us something to root for. Introduce supporting characters, including the ally and hinderer, as rich and interesting. Give them distinctive names, appearances, mannerisms, emotions, and actions. Use description to evoke a sense of their broader culture or background. Don't allow supporting characters to be stereotypes. Also, use the ordinary life to make crystal clear what the protagonist wants and at least hint at what they need or how they're going to have to change. This also builds empathy. Make the stakes clear. Now, stakes in a love story may not be blatant or obvious, but we need to sense what the protagonist has to gain and lose with their ordinary behavior. For instance, in God's Own Country, we see that Johnny is risking the family farm with his careless behavior. And though we can see why he wants to escape, the presence of his hardworking, disabled father and grandmother conveys tradition and long-term commitment to a difficult way of life. You'll want to get to the inciting incident of the global story as soon as you've established the ordinary life. Get there quick. The main characters meet, or in the case of a marriage story, create major conflict in the couple. You want to threaten the protagonist's status quo to get that story rolling. Once the protagonist is thrown out of equilibrium, the middle build begins. Your story's middle build is all about complications and escalating stakes. Create scenes in Act 2, the first half of the middle build, where the antagonist attacks by showing that they are interested in or attracted to the protagonist. Show the protagonist sending mixed signals, fighting their own attraction, and or making mistakes that affect other areas of their life. Raise the stakes by slowly exposing your protagonist to greater and greater vulnerability. In God's Own Country, Johnny grows more and more miserable in fighting his attraction to George. Create a midpoint shift where the protagonist goes from reactive to proactive in relation to the other. They begin to admit that they want the relationship. The midpoint shift is usually a subtle moment or only implied in subtext and often involves a change of location. In God's Own Country, though the location is the same, we're given a brand new big perspective on Johnny's physical surroundings of Yorkshire. And it's as if he has entered a new world by seeing it through George's eyes. The midpoint shift moves us into Act 3, the second half of the middle build. Here's where you separate your partners. This could be a breakup, it could be a parting forced by external circumstances. They may remain in the same place, but become estranged because the protagonist's internal barriers against vulnerability make the other just give up. Then create an all is lost moment by removing the protagonist's hope of ever gaining the other's love. In God's Own Country, this is when George gives up, takes a job in Scotland to go away from Johnny's emotional blockage. And finally, it all pays off. In Act 4, you deliver a climactic scene where they reunite. The protagonist faces their fear or flaw. They make a sacrifice for love without expecting it to bring the loved one back to them. There's often a kind of false ending here where the sacrifice doesn't seem to be enough. But just when the connection seems impossible, the other recognizes the sacrifice. In a romance, they relent, and there's an act emblematic of love, a like a kiss or some other form of intimate connection. Your story then needs a resolution scene or two. If you're writing a happy, prescriptive story, the resolution should imply either a happy ever after or a happy for now outcome. If it's a cautionary or sad or tragic story, the resolution shows that attraction alone wasn't enough for the protagonist to make the needed internal changes, or that given even genuine love could not prevail over the forces arrayed against the characters. And that is how you construct a love story. And Anne's got a few final thoughts to share that will help you construct a winning love story. Anne?
Thank you, Rachelle. I've got just a few loose ends to tie up here. I see the clock is ticking, so we got to move along. The first thing, loose end, we want to talk about is pacing. It's an often misunderstood term, and it doesn't mean one action scene after another moving really fast. It refers to the reader's expectation of experiencing the key moments that Rachelle just talked about at the right places in the story. And we've just been given those landmarks. You'll have a chance to study them again. Get the act structure right, and you're 75% of the way to solving any pacing problems. Pacing in a love story depends on scenes that have emotional turns. They turn on strong emotion. Love stories support more description than some other story types, but don't get carried away with emerald orbs and tawny locks that don't move the story forward. It's a temptation in love stories. Change up your scene types. Avoid multiple two-person conversations in a room. Add dynamism by changing location, adding a third character, creating a setting that's challenging in some way, that sort of thing. Even if your story is the steamy, erotic type, don't depend too heavily on bedroom scenes. And speaking of that, a word about sex in love stories, just very briefly. Not all love stories require sex scenes, not even romantic ones. It depends on what kind of story you're writing, what level of heat, the subgenre you're working in it is expected by the reader. So balance the explicit and the intimate with, sorry, I've lost my place here. Balance the explicit with just the merely suggestive, and prefer intimate scenes that develop the character. If you are writing erotic romance, be sure to know your market and how much explicit sex the reader for that market expects to find on the page. Reader emotion is especially important in a love story because love is personal. The emotion they want to feel might be romantic anticipation, joy, celebration, or sorrow, pity, and cathartic tears, but it's up to you to deliver and deliver big. Remember that love is personal. Writing about it, you should be prepared to do the inner work yourself. You should feel stirred by your own story. Mine your own desires, fears, preferences, kinks, whatever, for the material. Personal truth resonates with readers. And you may have to dig deeper into your own psychology of desire and vulnerability to write what you were planning to write. But that's the path to innovation. The love story theme is old, so create freshness by exploring different aspects of love. Dare to write unusual combinations of characters, settings, and scene types between less typical, less mainstream characters, for example. There is so much more to say about love than courtship and marriage. Write what others are hesitant to write by being bold, brave, and vulnerable yourself, and then you'll have a good love story. Well, we have covered a lot here. I'm going to recap very quickly while you get, I see we have plenty of questions already in the Q&A box. You have learned why we tell love stories. You've learned all of the essential story requirements. I'll just go through those quickly here. And now you have the basics of building a love story and the structural framework that you can use to build a good one and a plan to finish your love story. So congratulations. We have covered a heck of a lot here today. Before we go to the Q&A, just a reminder, please do go and download the 7 Essential Story Types Guide at storypath.me and get on the list to hear about all the exciting things that Pages and Platforms is offering in the near future. And that's it. Boy, we sped through that. Let's go to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Anne and Rachelle. That was an absolutely amazing session, jam-packed with information. So we have so many questions have come through over this session, and we're going to get through as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. So one of the most common questions we've had is about the happily ever after and the happily for now. How necessary do you think it is that a romance includes one of these?
The romance novel is a specific genre form. It absolutely requires a happy ever after or happy for now ending. That is like the fundamental sine qua non of the romance novel, as distinct from other forms of love stories. Absolutely.
Yeah. So another romance question we have here is, what are your tips for writing a couple falling in love in a short time frame?
Rachelle?
I would
quick
say,
thoughts on that?
I would say draw from your own experiences, again, desires. Don't be afraid to pull from scenes that, or parts of stories that you've loved before. Falling quick, I mean, gosh, you know, that's love at first. You don't even have to explain it that much. I've had a number of clients say, oh, but I got to show why they like each other. No, I don't know why my brother fell for his wife. I have no idea, but I assume that it was plausible. And what I think Anne said in this one, make sure it's plausible.
Okay. So how likely would you say it is that a romance novel is going to be published if it's mixed with other genres? Does that make it more or less sellable in your opinion?
It depends on what you mean by other genres. There are fantasy romances, historical romances, gay romances, et cetera, et cetera. So they seem to be doing very well in the market. They're growing. It's a category that's growing. If you start blending it with action, you're moving over into kind of maybe the romantic thriller, which is a little bit different. Read a lot and very current recent stuff, and you will be able to get a better feel for what blends are working this year. Things change very fast in this industry.
And I would say that the primary thing you want to do is make sure you're using marketing language to speak to the particular readers that would like your book. Don't promise them a romance if it doesn't have a happy ending, right? Don't promise them a romance if it's all about surviving a snowstorm. If the life and death stakes are higher, if there are life and death stakes, it's usually not simply a love story or not primarily a love story, because we're more worried about, are they going to live or die?
Yeah, nice. So on to some more general plot questions. What would you say are some of the best elements to include to make an irresistible female protagonist?
Make her realistic, for one thing. No breasting boobily down the stairs. I mean, I don't need to tell women how to write women, but consult your own experience. If you're a woman writer, consult your own experience. If you are not a woman writer, consult women to make them have their struggles be realistic, aligned with their place in life, their appearance, their job, their intelligence, not just how glamorous they look in sexy outfits.
And would you say that writing a male protagonist has the same kind of concept, the base concept?
Yeah, I would say writing any character has the same basic concept of consult reality. It's a story and you get to play with reality, but have the character's actions arise organically from who you conceive them to be, what you conceive their past to be, and so forth.
I think both characters, protagonist, antagonist, even your surrounding characters, need to have what I call agency. They need to be acting towards, for, away from what they want and what they need. They need to be active in some way, where avoiding can be active, speech can be active, refusing to make a decision can be active, but they need to be doing something and hopefully in conflict with other characters.
And not just be done to.
Yeah, that's a really great tip. So unfortunately, we are running out of time. So I'm just going to go for one more quick question to finish us off. So I know you've been talking a lot about protagonists changing. And if somebody has multiple protagonists, is it acceptable to have one who doesn't really change, or does every protagonist need to be changed for a successful story?
First thing, you really don't have multiple protagonists. I think by and large, the best choice is to decide that one is primary and the others that you may have are secondary, and focus on the primary protagonists change. I understand what you're talking about, but your secondary characters should probably change some, but the main thing about a protagonist is that the protagonist is one character and changes.
Or there's such a heroic, admirable figure that they change the people around them, but they're going
True.
to suffer dramatically because of their unwillingness to change. That would be something like Gladiator. Right?
Gladiator.
Yeah. And thank you guys so much for such a great session. And thank you everyone for joining. A big
I'll be over in the Facebook. I'll be over answering questions on Facebook.
Yes, Rachelle has really kindly agreed to join us in the Facebook group and answer any of your questions that we didn't manage to get through today. I know there were so many more in the Q&A box that we just haven't had time for, and we'll start a thread there so nothing gets lost. Absolutely not. It was an amazing session. A big thank you to both of you for generously spending your time with us. We can't wait to see you again. I know you are happy to work with ProWritingAid. And as always, you can find the replay to this session and all the other sessions in the Romance Writers Week Hub. My colleague is just dropping the links again in the chat now, so you can find them. And we hope that everyone joins us for our next sessions, and catch you next time. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.